Hello and welcome. It is me, Nathan, your friendly neighborhood support engineer, and in today's video we're going to be talking about site-to-site OpenVPN connections. Now, the OpenVPN, it tends to be a little bit more complex one to set up, especially compared to all the other VPNs we support on our router. But with that being said, we're going to kind of dive into a more complicated setup. That way I can show you a little bit more of the router. Beyond the aspect of VPN, we're going to be working with a multi-LAN subnet. We're going to have a default VLAN 20, VLAN 30 network running on our server. Then our client's going to have the default network of the third octet ending in 123. But as you can see in this topology, we have two ways of accessing the equipment. We can do this over the internet with port forwarding, which most of you may have already been familiar with. If you don't know what port forwarding is and how to do that on our equipment, I do have a video and I'll link it to you in the top right hand corner here. But with that being said, we're going to train our main focus on the VPN connection. So when you connect in through the VPN, we will be able to establish SIP connections through there. And this will not only have to be configured on the router, but also on the UCM as well, because it is very imperative that all traffic that comes in through the VPN tunnel, which is going to be the 10.0.10.0 subnet, we want to make sure that we recognize that traffic as local traffic. And if this is configured properly, you will see that all connections through SIP will show up as the local IP and not the IP of the actual tunnel address. If you do see the tunnel address, you may have done something wrong. But if you watch this video carefully, you won't run into any of those mistakes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in to describe what we're setting up here. Alright, to start off, we have to make sure that we identify our WAN ports. Now, I know what you're probably saying, but those are local IPs. Why don't you have public? Well, first off, I don't want to be advertising my company's public IPs. Second off, it's much easier to demonstrate. So we have our two routers here, the VPN server that's on the right and the VPN client that's on the left. The client has the 42.167 address in blue. The other one has the 42.81, which is our server. Now, if you notice on the server, we have three different subnets. The default network is going to be the normal data network. The VLAN 20 is going to be a simulated VoIP isolation network. And the green VLAN 30 is going to be our guest network, which we're actually going to broadcast all three networks on our GWN 7610, which is our AP. One thing you want to consider, especially in a topology like this, we do have a switch involved here. And if you are going to be working with VLANs, it is imperative that you configure that switch to send these VLANs across its ports, whether it's going to be a native VLAN, which is our default, or going to be a tagged VLAN like VLAN 20 or 30. Then over to the left, we have the more simplistic setup with our VPN client, which only has a default network, no VLANs. It's just hook it up, get everything leased out with DHCP, and configure the phones with these SIP settings. Now at this moment, currently nothing is connected over SIP, but our main goal here is to make sure that this UCM can actually communicate with the local phones on the remote network. We want to make sure that these phones can go up through to the router, on through the VPN tunnel, through the internet, back down the VPN tunnel of the server, and down to the UCM. Now, I would recommend taking a screenshot of this because I will be referencing IP addresses as we're configuring the OpenVPN server, and it will be handy. With that being said, let's go ahead. We're going to start off with the OpenVPN server. We're going to get that configured. We're going to get the certificates created for the client, and I'll show you how to both download those and apply them to the client, as well as looking at some access control policy with some firewall rules. We'll make sure that when we get this set up, we can control who's allowed to connect to what network and ensure a security-oriented connection. All right, now that we're at the web pages, let me go ahead and get you oriented with my tabs here. I have it logically set as kind of like our topology. As you can see, I have the server GWN on the right-hand side. Then just to the left of that, we have the client GWN, which is going to be connecting to our server here. So keep that in mind. Then on the far end of the client side, we have our remote phones at the third octet 123 network, which I currently do not have access to. The reason why I don't have access to this is because I am directly connected to the switch on the server side. So no wonder I don't have access to that, but we're going to fix that real soon. Going back to the server here, as you can see just to the right of that, we have the UCM 6202. Now, like I said, not only we're going to be configuring the VPN server here, we're also going to do some critiques on the UCM to make sure that the SIP traffic can flow in either direction and do it reliably with no audio issues or no drop calls. Because if you're running into that kind of stuff, it could be a UCM issue or it could be a VPN issue. It's going to be hard to tell. That's why I wanted to make this video and clarify a lot of these things. But with that being said, let's go to the server. We're going to go ahead and log into the server first off, because that will be the first step in creating the Openvpn server. Alright, now that we're in, the first step in creating a site-to-site OpenVPN connection is obviously to create a certificate for our client. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go to System Settings, Cert Manager, and we're going to be creating our first cert. As you can see, I don't have any certs created. So the first one that we're going to create is for the site-to-site connection. We're going to go ahead and give this a common name, like Remote 7000. Now, key length, obviously you might not want to leave it at 512. I'm going to go ahead and use 2048, which should be more than enough of what we need. Lifetime in days is how long we will accept there being a site-to-site connection, or for that client to even be connected during that certain amount of time. So I'd recommend making this something absurdly high. That way we don't have to worry about coming back and recreating a cert for our site-to-site connection. Obviously, you can find out your max by just putting in any random number, and we can see our max right there. So I'll leave it as is. The utmost max, state or province. Now, this is going to be a mandatory field. I'm going to put our city, organization, GS, organizational unit. Now, this is all just informational stuff, something that's not going to make or break our VPN, so you could almost put whatever you want in there. And we're going to go ahead and put in our email. Actually, it's not gmail.com. It is grandstream.com. All right, now that we have this cert created, I'm going to go ahead and download this cert. Perfect. That will come in handy for our client connection, and we will be uploading that cert directly to the client. And next, we're actually going to create our certificate for the server. I'm going to go ahead and click Add. We're going to make sure that this is a server type here. We're going to give it a common name. I'm going to call this Site-to-Site OpenVPN. As you can see, I'm already using the client certificate key. That is what we generated on the CA certificate. Certificate type is going to be server. Key length, let's make that 2048. Lifetime in operation, you already know what this is for. Make that the max. State, province. Organization. And email. There we go. Now that we have that created, we're going to go ahead and actually create a user for the CA certificate and the server connection itself. So now that we have that done, we're going to go to User Manager. We're going to click Add. We're going to make sure it's enabled first. That's a very common mistake. Give this a name. Actually, I'm not going to use my name. I'm going to say this is the GWN 7000 client. Username, we'll call this one Nathan. Password. Now you want to use something strong here. So I'm going to go ahead and use something real strong. Now you are going to want to copy this if you have the chance. Now the Openvpn subnet is going to be the remote subnet of the client connection. So since we know what that is, that's going to be the 192.168.123.0 off the /24. Now if the client had more than one subnet there, we can go ahead and click add and add the other subnets in there as well. But we only have one subnet, so we made it easy. Let's go ahead and click save. Let's apply those changes. Now that we got that out of the way, we're going to go ahead back to the cert manager and create our client config. Now I know what you're probably saying, well, why didn't we create the client config while we're here? Well, that's because in the client config portion, we're actually going to need to have a user first before we create this, or you won't be allowed to create it. And I'll show you exactly why. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this from server to client. Now, as you can see here, GWN client is what we had just created in the user field. So if you didn't do that first, you'd be scratching your head figuring out, why you don't have anything drop down here. I'm going to go ahead and call this GWN 7000 site to site. We'll be using the remote certificate, the only one that we have, the remote 7000. The username, which we just created not even a few moments ago, we're going to use that one. Key length 2048. Lifetime in days, we'll make this the max. State province. Organization, email. Then after we're done saving those changes, you want to go ahead and click on the certificate to export the certificate and do this for the key as well. Now this is what the client will use in order to authenticate to the VPN server. All right, now that we have that done, we're going to go ahead and actually finally create the VPN. So in order to create the VPN, you have to make sure that you create these client certificates first, the user certificate, and so forth. If you don't do that, it's going to be a lot like some of the other settings where if you skip a step, you'll end up having blank drop-down fields. So let's go ahead. We're going to go to VPN. We're going to make sure we're clicked on OpenVPN, not the L2TP or PPTP or IPsec. We want OpenVPN, and we will be creating it as a server. We're going to make sure that this is enabled. Now we're going to call this site to site OpenVPN. I'm going to keep mainly all the defaults, but if you want to go ahead and change your server mode, you can, but I'm going to keep it as SSL. We're going to make this connection over UDP. You can change that if you want. Keep in mind what interface we're enabling this for, as well as the local port. This will come in handy for when we create the client connection, because if we don't choose the right port, obviously we're not going to get the signals through. Next, we're going to concern ourselves with a little access control here. When we enable the destination, we're allowing where the VPN connection is allowed to go. So if I go ahead and enable the default network, that means anyone who's connected through the client on the VPN network will have access to the default network. So I'm going to enable the default network and the VLAN 20 network. Who knows, you might want it different. Maybe you only want the VPN connection to be oriented with with the SIP protocol because you're just trying to support VoIP on it, and you don't want it to have connections to your default network or the VLAN 30 guest network. More than likely, you don't want it connected to the guest network. But this is where you're actually going to be controlling where the VPN connections are allowed to access. So I'm going to keep it the default network because that's the network I'm on right now. So I want to make sure that I can test it, as well as my VLAN 20, which is my VoIP network. Encryption type, I'm going to leave it as such. And as you can see, the certificate authority is going to be the remote 7000. That was what we've created earlier. Server certificate, site-to-site OpenVPN, and now we're going to do the VPN Tunnel Network. Now this is going to be the actual network that's created to connect both the client and server network, and like I did in the topology, we're going to be using 10.0.10.0 off the /24. Next, we have push route. Now, push route, think of it like this. If I have any subnet I want to advertise to the connected client, push route is going to help me accomplish that. So I'm going to make sure I advertise all 3 default networks, unless you want to restrict one network from having a route on the client side. So you can omit subnets, but just be very wary, because if you forget to add a subnet that you need, you won't be able to get access to it, and your client won't have a route for it. So with that being said, let's go ahead, 192.168.1.0 off of /24. That is my default network. I'm going to make sure I add that. The other network I want to have access to is the 192.168.20.0 off the /24. Now, it'd probably not be best for me to give access to the guest network, because more than likely the clients on the VPN don't need access to the guest network. But if they do, you can add it here. But for the sake of being more realistic in a real-world environment, I'm not going to add the guest network because that's not needed. LZO compression, I'm not going to have that enabled. I'm going to click Save. We're going to apply. And here's the moment of truth. If I've done everything correctly on the server side, I should see a connection happening. And as you can see, my VPN is up and the status is connected. Now, this is the server actually checking itself to making sure that the VPN connection is operable and can be used. If at this point you do not have it, the status say it's connected, then we have done something wrong. So go ahead and rewatch that part of the video. All right, now that we have the connection successfully connected, we want to make sure that our network groups are allowed to communicate with the OpenVPN. Now, this is one of the steps that are commonly overlooked, and it will make or break your ability to route to the other side of the VPN, whether it's a client connection to a server or a server connection to a client. So we're going to go to router, LAN, and within LAN, here's where we can specify our routing policies. So our default network, we definitely want to make sure has the access to the VPN connection, and that's going to be the site-to-site OpenVPN. We're also going to do this with VLAN 20, but we will not do this for the guest network for obvious reasons, not unless you want the guest network to have access to the site-to-site OpenVPN. And click Apply Changes. And at this point, we are ready to work with the client. So let's go ahead and move on over. All right, now that we're logged in, we're going to go ahead and configure the client-side VPN. Now, this is probably the easier part of this portion, but it can still get a bit confusing, especially if you don't know what you're putting in. First, we're going to enable it, then we're going to name the VPN. This is going to be case sensitive, so be very careful. When in doubt, copy and paste out. So I'm going to copy the name here, move it over here, and paste. We know we're going to be using UDP. We're not going to bind a local interface. Then we can go ahead and choose what interface that our connection is going to be oriented out of. So it's going to be WAN 1. We can also specify our local VPN port, which is not going to be in confliction with the remote. And next after that, we also want to make sure that we allow connections from the server VPN to hit our default network. And we simply do that by enabling the default network. Next, we're going to go ahead and put in some of the server information for the remote OpenVPN server. This will be the IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the IP address. Add that here. Now we could specify the local tunnel address and the remote tunnel address. This is for if you want to lock down your IPs to your OpenVPN server. There are some advantages of doing this, especially when you have more than one client connecting to the same one and you want to statically allocate those IPs. But this is actually an optional field and you don't need to do this. One thing you also want to pay attention to here is going to be the remote OpenVPN server port. For every VPN connection or tunnel that you create on your server, you will eventually have to assign it a different port because you can't have conflicting OpenVPN tunnels with the same port. So just keep that in mind. We know we're using the default here, so we're going to be using 1194. But beyond that, auth mode, we're using SSL on the server. Encryption algorithm, we're using the bloatfish, so we know that we're going to use that here. SHA-1, we've used that on the server. We're not using TLS, but here, this is where things oftentimes get most confusing for most of my customers because this is a little bit confusing. If you remember, on the server, we had something called push route. This is concerning the local subnets of the server. However, on the client side, it's much different because on the client side, we're going to be putting here the remote subnets of the server. So it's actually inverse to what we actually did with push routes. This is just actually declaring routes of what's to be expected on the other side of that server. So we know that we have the default network, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. Now, I'm going to carry it and just say we're only going to be doing the default network and the VLAN 20 because we don't want to give the VPN access to the guest network. So I'm going to go ahead and create those routes here. So the remote server address, if we remembered, and if we want to, we can go ahead and click on the server, go back and look at the LAN. And here we can verify what the networks were. We have the 1, the 20, and the 30. 30 we're going to admit. /24. Then we're going to do 192.168.20.0/24. There we go. Now I could add the guest in here, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want this client side to have access to my guest network. We do have the option not to pull routes automatically from the server because it is the server's job to advertise what routes it actually has. So we're not going to do that here. We also have the option of IP masquerading. Now this is just a fancy word for natting when connecting through a VPN tunnel, meaning that your IP is going to be masked by your tunnel address, which we don't want, especially for VoIP applications, so we're not going to be using that. Just like we did on the server for the LZO compression, we are not going to be using this. And now it's time to add our certificates. Now I've cleaned up my downloads here, that way it's a little bit easier to see this. We're going to be using the CA cert for the first one, the client certificate, and then the private key. And then the password that I entered in on the server, I'm going to go ahead and enter in here. Apply changes. All right, that was quick now that we have gotten connected. It's no time to celebrate just yet. I mean, obviously, we can see the TX and the RX being sent back and forth between both. That means that we do have even flow between each network, so we know that it might be working. However, there's a couple things that you don't want to celebrate too early on, and this is definitely one of them. So if we go to routes and the LAN side, we're going to actually edit the LAN here and make sure that the LAN clients have access to the VPN tunnel. Because if you don't do that, then all the client endpoints will never be able to access the VPN tunnel. So this is a big gotcha, especially when you first configure it, because you go celebrate really early thinking everything's connected, and then it is not, because you can't get your remote clients to communicate with your server. So now that we have that set, we can go ahead and start verifying our work. So in order to do that, we're actually going to go to Routing and click on Routes, and from here we can look at our built-in routes that we have. Now the ones that you want to pay attention to are the ones that end in the interface of the tunnel address. As you can see here is our tunnel subnet. We know that looks good. You will always have more than 2 here for good reference, but the one thing that's important here is that we have the target route, which we know that we have the 1.0/24 subnet here. We see that the next hop is actually going to the other router, or actually to the interface of our router, but then we'll be going through that tunnel. We also have 20, and obviously we didn't add the guest, so we know that the client's good. So let's go ahead and look at the server. I'm going to go ahead and click on the server. I'm going to click on Routing, click on Routes, and let's make sure that this one's good. We're looking for the tunnel addresses. As you can see, same as the client, we have this subnet put in, but what we're looking for here is that the 123 network is able to be routed to the client. And as you can see, this is going to be the 10.0.10.2 address, which more than likely has been assigned to our client server. With that being said, we're all good to go. All I have to do now is wait and see if my phones will register to the server. The best way to do that is go ahead and just log right into the phone. As you can see, my computer is currently located on the server-side LAN connection, so the fact that I'm getting the web page of one of the remote phones tells me that our VPN is working. Let's go ahead and log into this phone and see if it's registered. And would you look at that? This phone's already up and registered. Now that's great, we got registration going, but that doesn't necessarily mean traffic's going to be routed correctly, because the SIP protocol is very sensitive to RTP and SIP negotiation changes that could be occurring in a set network environment. And this often takes the form of configuring SIPNet on the UCM, which I have not done. So I'm going to go to my UCM here. I'm going to go to PBX settings, SIP settings, go to NAT. Now we can go ahead and leave our external host as our public IP, which I'll do here. And then I'm going to actually whitelist our local subnets for both the local subnet of the UCM on our server. I'm going to be doing this for the default and the VoIP network, but I also want to whitelist the remote VPN subnet, not the tunnel network, but the remote subnet of the client-side router. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to do 192.168.20.0/24. We're going to go ahead and click Add on that. Oops, I forgot. We don't need /24 anymore. That was the old firmware. So we're going to go ahead and add that. Then we're going to add the default network, 192.168.1.0 off the /24. That's going to be our default network. Now, if you wanted to, we could also add the guest network, but more than likely, we're not going to be getting any VoIP traffic coming from there, unless the guest has GS Wave handy and they want to register to our server, which is highly unlikely, which I'm not going to do. But last but not least, let's go ahead and add the local subnet of the remote connection, so the 192.168.123.0 off the /24. Now, this will ensure that any traffic coming from the remote VPN subnet is not going to get treated like public traffic. And the problem with that with SIP is if it's treated like public traffic, we're going to exchange our external host information, which is going to be completely wrong. So then we're going to end up having a weird routing loop where we're going to end up getting either one-way audio or calls getting cut out after 30 seconds. So we want to make sure that any remote VPN connections, we're going to be whitelisting their subnets. So when they directly communicate with us, we can go ahead and make sure that we're stamping our information correctly. I'm now going to go ahead and apply these changes. It will reboot my device. But with that, that concludes the site-to-site OpenVPN tutorial with a little bit of VoIP sprinkled in on top. With that being said, my name's Nathan, I'm with Grandstream Support, and you have a good one. We hope that you found that video tutorial helpful, and if you did, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for the latest in video tutorials. I'm Nathan Sharp, you have a good one.